Okay, so we are recording now. And so just to introduce our speakers for this evening, we have Pat Nesbitt and Betty Sue Tao, and they are actually both part of the Master Gardener program that we have. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that. Basically, it's a volunteer program. They go through several hours of training, and then they contribute volunteer hours to the county or to different workshops and events and that kind of stuff. So they're here to kind of help today, talking about, I think Pat's going to talk about composting, and Betty Sue is going to talk about, I think, general gardening. And like I said, they are part of our Master Gardeners. Pat has been in the Master Gardener program since 2006. Betty Sue has been since about 2010, and they actually also teach gardening classes at the Votech Center here in Ardmore as well. So they should be able to hear you, Pat, and you are free to begin.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This seems really weird not being just able to see you and you be able to see us. And I want to apologize ahead of time. I'm fighting laryngitis and I hope you can hear me okay. We're going to talk a little bit about composting tonight. And I want to make it as easy as possible because there are whole books and whole encyclopedias on composting. So we're not going to make it that difficult. We're going to try to break it down. I'm assuming, since by the name of this series, that most of you have some land or room so that you can have composting. And I hope you do. Lucky if you do. But building better soil is the single most important thing you can do to improve your gardening success. If you've heard people say, oh, she's got a green thumb, she doesn't. She has really, really good soil. So you can have a green thumb too. The goal is to have soil that has good tilth. And tilth means the texture of the soil. It should be crumbly, not too loose like sand, which is what Betty Sue has, and not too tight like clay, which is what I have, and we live a few miles from each other. Adding organic matter is hands down, without a doubt, the #1 way to improve your soil. Whether your soil is clayey, sandy, low in nutrients, compacted, or has poor drainage, organic matter will fix it. And lucky you if you already have soil like this. I don't want to hear about it if you do. The end product we want is humus. Organic matter decomposes into humus, which benefits all soil types. Humus helps improve the soil's texture, which increases aeration and oxygen supply, and both the absorption and the drainage of water. Humus is a dark, moist soil composed of bits of dead, decomposing insects, leaves, roots, and plant matter. Sounds yucky, but that's a really, really good thing. Humus adds nutrients to the soil that plants need to grow and live. Humus will form naturally from the creation and addition of quality compost and other organic materials that break down in the soil. Healthy soil will create an adequate supply of humus. And the most important word there is healthy soil. These are some pictures of good, rich soil. And the bottom one is nice, rich humus. It even smells good when you smell it. So if you feed the soil will feed the plants. Soil is full of life. Soil scientists, which, yes, there are soil scientists, say that a handful of soil has more living organisms in it than the number of people on the entire earth. one handful. It has soil bacteria, it has fungi, and it has animals such as worms and arthropods. And the arthropods include mites, millipedes, centipedes, and springtails. And all those things feed on organic matter. They convert it into nutrients, and then the plants use those nutrients. They also leave channels as they dig in the soil, which increase oxygen and help water move through the soil. Like Betty Sue has sandy soil, and the water moves through her soil so much it moves through too much. And my heavy clay soil, it doesn't move enough, and it just stands, and a lot of the plant roots can rot actually if the water just stands. Earthworms. Earthworms are like underground farmers, and they create tunnels to help the water move more quickly and to provide pathways for plant roots to actually grow in. So earthworms do a lot of good for your soil. Sometimes compost is called black gold. Sometimes it's called gardener's gold. Whatever, it is your best friend if you want good soil. Compost is a must. Compost will improve your soil immediately and introduce microorganisms that will continue improving your soil by further breaking down organic matter. Now, compost is not going to make your soil perfect immediately, but it's going to make it better immediately. And just as you keep using it, it's just going to get better and better over time. If you add some compost in the spring before planting, you can side dress your plants with it throughout the growing season. You can add more in the fall when you're putting the garden to bed. Then you will see improvement quickly. And while it's true, plants don't care where their nutrients come from, the soil does. And the soil is a key to healthy plants. Since soil is full of living organisms that are working to break down organic matter into humus, there are things you should never do that can cause damage to your soil. How to quickly turn soil into dirt. Now, all those living organisms in your soil are what make that soil. If your soil is dead, or if it's under your fingernails or in your hair or on the bottom of your shoes, then it's dirt. And plants don't grow in dirt. Compaction of soil by heavy equipment or even walking on wet soil can ruin the structure of soil. Digging and tilling wet soil will also destroy the structure. So you never want to dig or work in your garden if it's wet. There is a very high salt content in chemical fertilizers, and they will kill all those helpful living organisms in the soil you work so hard to encourage. The amount of inactive ingredients in a bag of chemical fertilizer used as filler to keep fertilizer from clumping together are in far greater quantity than the amount of fertilizer actually in the bag. Most bags I've looked at say as much as 40% of the bag that you're buying is not fertilizer. And they will alter your soil's consistency, texture, and ability to hold moisture. Can you tell I'm not a big fan of chemical fertilizers? This doesn't have anything to do with it. I just think Yoda's cute. When you're pulling a weed and the entire root comes up, that's what you look like. This is my yard. Betty Sue and I both have a small acreage. I have 2 acres, and the pond takes up almost an acre. And when we built our house 20 years ago, it was heavy, heavy, heavy clay soil. So bad that that flower bed that you're looking at right now is what I see out my back windows. If I tried to dig in that to plant something, I would literally bend a trowel. I even bent a spade one time trying to dig in it. So over the years, I've just gradually added a lot of compost, and I keep everything mulched and let the mulch break down. And most of everything I have is in a raised bed. But as you can see, this was a little later in the summer last year. My raised beds are not huge raised beds. Those are just rocks that we got from Lowe's, and they're like, they're 4 inches thick. And that's enough over time that I can actually dig a hole with my hands now if I don't have a trowel with me. And it's just nice, loose, rich dirt. And I basically can grow just about anything in there. You see, I have trees and shrubs, and I call it cottage gardening. That's so I can plant whatever I want. And it's supposed to be official. But just the small bit, a raised bed, and then keeping the compost and mulch in there over the years. And it's not as thick as it's just the rock are. The earthworms and all those microorganisms that break the plant matter down actually take it down into the soil and bring the clay soil up and mix it together so that I can grow trees or whatever in it now. And it's probably a good, at least a foot deep before I hit clay. So we want to go from garbage to garden. It's compost time. What is composting? Composting is a natural way of turning organic matter into humus so you can make your own humus. Most of us are not blessed with really rich soil that is full of humus. Composting is a natural aerobic microbiological process that returns plant materials, nutrients to the soil where they can again be absorbed by plants for new growth. Compost supplies plants with nitrogen, additional nutrients, and beneficial microorganisms. Did you know soil is an antidepressant? The smell of Mycobacterium vacui, which is an organism found in soil, compost, and leaf mold, lights up neurotransmitters that release serotonin. And serotonin is that mood lifting hormone that you get when you run 20 miles. And I would much rather go out and play in the soil to get that serotonin and a mood lifting hormone than running. Why should we make compost? Compost increases the tilth, productivity, and workability of soil. And this is good, rich soil that has been improved. And it looks like she has actually pulled back the mulch and the compost that she's got on top of her soil. And eventually those things, that's all organic matter, and it will break down and keep making more really good soil. Homemade compost is inexpensive to make. It solves the problem of disposing of plant, kitchen, and other waste products that most people just put in the trash and go to the landfill. This is a chart showing all the organic matter, and from here all the way over, you see paper and cardboard, yard waste, food waste, anything except glass, metals, and plastics. And if you ever put plastic in your mulch, it will still be there in 100 years. So we want all organic material. Carbon and nitrogen. And you want a ratio of those. Maximum composting efficiency occurs when carbon is properly balanced with nitrogen. Let's keep it simple. Like I said, there are entire books written on how to compost, and you can get very, very scientific and very, very technical. You can get soil probes to go out and measure your temperature every day. You can turn it exactly every week, and you can put a certain amount of water, and you can do all those things if you have lots of time, which I'm guessing you don't. So let's try to keep it a little bit more simple. These are some of the books that are whole books written on composting, and you can find them. I just found these off of Amazon real quick. Most of them are pretty expensive. There's one for $64, and it's a paperback book, and it's only 186 pages long. You need some carbon, and carbon is the brown stuff. I told you I'm going to make it simple. And you need some nitrogen. That's the green stuff. And you need to aim for a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 3:1. Now, you don't have to be precise on this, and you don't have to measure it out to get a certain ratio. You just want to have about 3 times more of the brown stuff than you do of the green stuff, which is handy because it's a lot easier to get the carbon material or the dead plant stuff than it is to get fresh green stuff. Some nitrogen materials include green grass clippings that have not been treated with chemical fertilizers or herbicides, because I'm also a big proponent of going as organic as you can. You can use yard trimmings. You can use trimmings from trees, shrubs, flowers, and weeds, as long as the weeds are not going to seed at the time. And I actually often cut the seed heads off and still use the rest of the weed in compost. You can use produce trimmings from the kitchen and the garden. You can use eggshells, tea and coffee grounds, including the tea and coffee filters and tea bags. You can add some fish meal, blood meal, or cottonseed meal. But those are pretty expensive. A small 5-pound bag now at Lowe's has gone up in cost along with everything else. But if you just need a little bit to sprinkle to get your compost a little head start and make it a little hotter so it works a little faster, those are good to just sprinkle on it, and they're all organic. You can use manure from rabbits, chickens, goats, and cows. You can clean your barn if you're lucky enough to have stalls where you stall your animals, and use that bedding straw that's already mixed with organic fertilizer from your animals. Some of the carbon materials you can use include dried leaves, straw, shredded newspapers, unwaxed cardboard, and brown paper bags. And the newspapers, cardboard, and bags are all made from wood and trees. So they are organic and will break down in the soil. Even if you don't have very much and you can use 3 parts dried leaves to 1 part green grass clippings, that will actually make you a good compost with nothing else added to it. You're not going to find any green grass right now, but this summer you can find lots of it. Things not to put in your compost are meat scraps, bones, cat litter, pet manure, slick magazine pages, waxed cardboard, or large limbs, because those just will not break down. And the reason for not using the cat litter or the pet manure is because our pets are so close to us now biologically, that a lot of our pets have the same diseases that we do. And we have a lot of the same diseases that our pets do. And it's too easy to transfer those diseases back and forth. And sometimes disease germs are not killed if the compost isn't hot enough. So you can use grass clippings, leaves and weeds, animal manures, coffee grounds, newspaper, eggshells, flower prunings, fruits and vegetables. If your fruits and vegetables hang around too long and start to turn to compost in your kitchen, then just go ahead and put them in your compost pile. Do not use any kind of meat, because you will have all the neighbors' creatures coming to your yard, plus you will attract wild animals. Plus it doesn't break down the fat in the meat, slows down the composting project. You don't want large branches unless you can chip them up ahead of time. Remember, no synthetic products, no plastics, no pet or human solid waste. So when life gives you compost, grow a garden. And if you're really worried about trespassers, you can stick this sign out: trespassers will be composted. Is oxygen necessary? Yes, the bacteria and actinomycetes, which are fungi that actually do the work to break down your organic matter into compost, must have oxygen. If oxygen is in short supply, then the anaerobic organisms will take over, and they will cause a bad, undesirable smell. In other words, your compost will smell like garbage then. How much H2O? The ideal moisture level for a compost pile is about 50%. So compost should feel like a damp sponge that has been wrung out. So not too much water, you just want it moist. If your compost is too dry, you can add some water to it. If the water runs out of your compost when you squeeze a handful, then it's got too much water in it, and you just need to allow it to dry out a little bit. If you have black plastic or a tarp over it to keep it covered, you take the covering off, or you can add some more dry material to it, or you can take your garden fork or a pitchfork and mix it, and that will usually help it to dry out faster. Because once it gets too wet, it won't keep composting. You can provide adequate ventilation to your compost by turning the pile frequently or by venting it. And 4x4, people other than me have done all kinds of studies and found out that a 4 foot by 4 foot pile is an ideal size for a compost pile. And one of the reasons for that is if you're going to turn it yourself with a gardening fork, anything bigger than 4x4 is really heavy and really hard to turn. But 4x4 is not too bad. Now, if you look on the internet, you can find all kinds of fancy, expensive equipment to make your compost in. The one at the top right is actually a cute little bin to set on your counter in your kitchen, so you can remember to use all your food trimmings and eggshells and coffee grounds in there. Or you can do like Betty Sue and I do and stick a coffee can under the sink or a little bucket under there. Now, one problem with these fancy compost bins, if you will notice right off, is they aren't very big, and they're not going to make a lot of compost if you want a lot. So you can get real simple here and go find some leftover hardware wire or chicken wire and make a circle of it and dump all your grass trimmings and leaves and things in that. The one on the bottom right is actually a black trash can, and they're really easy. Even the black absorbs more heat in the winter. You need to drill a few holes in the sides and the bottom so it won't hold too much water. And I even read a lady said she always puts the lids on top that have the handles that clamp it on so they won't come off. And then she puts it out in the yard and has her grandkids play a game with it where they roll it around to each other in the yard. So she's getting her compost turned and entertaining her grandkids at the same time. This is another really simple one. They have either old leftover lumber and they just have chicken wire wrapped around it, so you can see it still gets plenty of airflow and ventilation, and the extra water can drain out, but it's pretty big size. Plus, we're going for the cheap here. I mean, a good compost one that you buy on the internet can be $300. This one, they probably used materials they already had and did it for free, and I think that's always best. This is what most people kind of aim for when they're really into composting. See, it's also made out of leftovers. You can tell by looking at some of those boards. They did not just go out to Lowe's and buy those. The first bin on the left is where you add all your new material. Just keep adding it to that. And after it's composted for a while and you need to turn it, instead of just turning it, they take it out and add it to the second bin, the one in the middle. And it's like half composted by this time. Then they start adding new material into the left one. Once the middle one has finished composting pretty well and needs to be turned, instead of just turning it, they take it out and put it into the one on the far right. And that's the one that winds up having their finished compost in it. As they use it up, you still have the other bins to be adding to it. And if you'll notice the middle bin, they've actually added ventilation to it so they don't have to turn it very often. That you can get is probably a 4-inch PVC pipe, and you can get the perforated ones, and they just stick it into the middle of the pile, and that actually lets more air into there. Now, this one is a little fancier, and it looks like they did go to Lowe's and buy new lumber. And if you've priced lumber lately, I would be looking for some used lumber. And they actually added the 4-inch ventilated PVC pipes to the middle too, because that would be really hard to get in there and try to turn that. But the PVC pipes make it a lot easier. And if you notice behind their compost bin, they have their own handy dandy supply of nitrogen to add to it. Now, this is what that third bin looks like after it's been composting for a while. She has also a ventilation pipe running in through it. And personally, I actually like compost when it's this composition, instead of letting it get really fine and really cooked down. I like it when it has some, it's not too big to add to the garden, but it has some, still has some chunks of organic matter in it. And I like it because when I add that to my flower beds, like the one I showed you is what I use, the smaller stuff kind of sifts down into the soil. And then the earthworms take it down even further and mix it with the soil. And then the bigger stuff on top settles on top, and it makes a natural mulch. And another reason I like it is because it takes it a lot longer to break down. So it's actually going to last you longer once you put it in your garden beds. So composting temperatures. The optimum temperatures are between 100 and 140 degrees, because those higher temperatures kill disease organisms, insects, and some weed seeds. Weeds are tough. That's if you know the weeds have gone to seed, it's better to cut those off. Composting at the center of the pile is complete when temperatures that within the pile drop below 100 degrees. And you'll know because if you have, you can even make a compost pile in the winter sometimes, and it heats up so much, you will actually see steam coming off your compost pile. And once you don't see the steam anymore, and you can actually use, they make thermometers with soil probes. You can stick down in the middle if you want to, or just take your garden fork or whatever and kind of pull it away and turn it a little bit, and you can tell, you'll get to know when it's finished. Now, the material on the outside edges of the pile may not have reached a hot enough temperature because it doesn't have as much material there to heat up. If so, then you just need to turn the pile and put those outside edges on the inside, and then it will start composting more. Small particles of organic material decompose faster because there are more surfaces for the bacteria to work on. You should chop up brush and tree and shrub prunings to compact them, and you should shred leaves to prevent layering. You know how oak leaves out in the woods just layer on top of each other and pack down. So if they're broken up a little bit, they're going to compost better. However, if you have all your compost very small particles, they may compact so much that they restrict oxygen availability. So a blend of small and a little bit larger particles actually are more efficient, and you don't have to spend as much time chopping everything up. For a successful compost pile, step 1, select a site that gets sun in the winter to take advantage of natural heating if you want to try to make compost all year round. You want a site that's convenient for adding materials. You don't want it so far away from the house and from where you work in the yard that it's a chore to take things to it. And you want to make it easier for you to remove your finished compost so that you can actually use it. You want a place that has water that's not too far away, at least where the hose will reach. And you want a place that's not going to detract from your landscape, and it's not a problem for you or your neighbors. So you probably don't want it right in your front yard. If you buy or make a container for your compost, it should be accessible, really easy to get to. It should resist decay and allow airflow. And some good examples of those are just like some cedar posts, or some metal posts would even be better, or just some rebar and wrap some chicken wire around it. Some wooden pallets, cinder blocks, and prefabricated structures, except those are the ones that are expensive. Now, if you don't have a huge yard and you don't need a huge amount of compost, these little compost tumblers are easy. You see it has a handle down in the bottom right. So as you add your kitchen scraps and things to it, it's easy to turn that handle and just keep your compost tumbled. I've read if you start to buy one, they'll say, now you can make new compost every 21 days. I kind of doubt that. I think it's possible if you have really small stuff and keep it turned and keep it in the sun and keep it watered just right. But it is actually possible in like 4 to 6 weeks on an average to make compost. And this would be good if you were making compost and you just had a few containers on the patio or porch that you were making it for. But if you're wanting, and by the way, this is what's going to happen if you get one of those little tumblers. This is what you're going to look like when you realize you're going to need a bigger composting bin. And also, by the way, that cigarette in his mouth has a deadly organic substance. It's one of the deadliest in the world, and it's called nicotine. And if you even smoke and have a little bit of nicotine on your fingers and you go out and work with your tomatoes, you can give them a deadly disease that will actually kill your tomatoes. Now, there are several methods for composting. There is one called open composting, sheet composting, and pit composting. And we're not going to get technical about these. These are easy. And I always say when you're doing something, this is my garden philosophy. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And if you'll notice, they ran out of rocks, they ran out of bricks, they started using some concrete blocks, whatever they had, and you don't even notice. And by the end of the summer, all those plants are going to be growing off those and look really natural anyway. This is a really good sample of open composting. And if most of you have plenty of land where you can do this, and if you have animals, even better, you're going to have to do something with that material that you clean out of the stalls, or old hay or old straw. And it's just a good idea to dump it out in the open, away from the barn, because it will attract more flies, and you get plenty of those near the barns anyway. But if you clean it out and you have a huge pile like this, and you pile it, it actually is better if when you make your compost to always put it on open ground, because the bacteria from your soil is actually going to get in there and help to break it down faster. Now, I would not even attempt to turn that with a garden fork, but I'm thinking if you have that much land and that much straw and horse bedding to dispose of, you're probably going to have a tractor. So it works great just to use the bucket on the tractor and turn it occasionally, or even you could just move it someplace else close by really easily. But that would make a good compost, and it would make a lot of it. There is a problem if you have animals and you feed them hay. It can be a problem. It's called the satanic grazon herbicide, and it's actually aminopyralid, which is the ingredient in the grazon. It's also in other herbicides, and the word herbicide means it's going, whatever you use that is going to kill whatever plant you put it on, probably. Now, the thing about grazon and any other herbicides that have this product in it is it's used a lot by ranchers and farmers because it does a really neat trick. It won't kill the alfalfa or Bermuda you're growing to bale your hay, but it will kill the broadleaf weeds in it, like cockleburr, horse nettle, horsetail, Jimson weed, bull thistle, and ragweed. And a lot of those weeds I just named off are actually poisonous to horses. So if you're raising your own hay, you don't want those weeds growing in your grass that you're going to bale for your horses. The problem comes in when you buy your hay from someone else and you don't know what they've put on it to kill the weeds in the hay. They've done some testing on the grazon, and they're not quite sure, but they know if you feed your horses grazon, the problem is it goes right through their system and it stays in the manure. And then you use that manure to make your compost and you fertilize your gardens with it, your beautiful homemade compost, and it can kill every single thing in your garden for at least 3 years. And I've heard up to 7 years. It can stay active in your hay. So I don't know how you know for sure whether it has in it, but Betty Sue and I both know several people who have actually used it on their gardens, and it killed every single thing in their garden. Had beautiful gardens and everything was dead. So be careful if you can, and try to check and make sure that the hay you buy or your hay does not have the grazon on it. Now, this is a good, fast, easy way to make a compost bin. They just had some leftover chicken wire or hardware cloth, and it looks like they even stapled to the tree to use it for a post, and put a couple of rebar stakes in there, and it would be really easy to pull those up and move the wire out of the way so you can get in there and turn it, or when it's done so you can get in there to use it. This is another pretty simple way. They just have a wire bins and they're sitting on the ground, and it looks like they've just loaded them up with leaves and grass clippings and straw and whatever they found. And instead of raking those up and putting them in plastic bags and sending to the landfill, they're going to have some nice compost. It may take a little longer since it looks like all they have is brown stuff, but it will eventually break down. If you have some old, not hay bales that have been treated with grazon, but if you have some old hay bales or straw bales, just use them to make your own enclosure. Put your other things that you want to compost on the inside of them. That's got 3 walls around it, so it'd be easy to get into it. And then the straw or hay itself will actually break down too, and you can make compost for you right there on the ground. And old hay bales are not good for feeding the animals for much else, but they will be good in compost. Now, if you have some concrete blocks and you want something a little bit more permanent, you can make a large pile of compost there. And what they did was actually make it wide enough so you could get in there with a bucket on the tractor to turn it. And that would make your job a lot easier. Your back would be, thank you. These are a few wooden pallets that I found pictures on the internet of. Now that top one on the right looks pretty simple, but that would be expensive because you can tell that's fairly decent wood and stuff in there. But most of these are made from old pallets, and you can still get pallets someplace. A lot of times if you have large bags of feed delivered, they'll put them in the back of your truck on a pallet that you get to keep. On sometimes stores, you can find a lot of feed stores or different places that have them piled in the alley, and if you ask, they will let you have them. Now, the one on the bottom left, I think, like I said, it would be better if it was on open ground instead of even putting a bottom in it. And they've actually used like whole pallets here and put them together, because the hardest part of using pallets and the wood on them is actually taking them apart so you can use the wood. So this is just an easy way to make a free one. This is another one. and they actually took the pallets apart on this one and used the lumber from it. But they made nice big bins, and that one on the right looks like they've been using their compost already. This is one, now you can buy these, but like I said, they're expensive. The first one on the left is where they're adding all their new material. Then they have a clothespin in the middle so that it can actually keep it from getting washed out. But well, look what they did. They made it so they can actually remove those slats and a few at a time and get down in there so they can actually get their compost out. If you don't have any old pallets or any old lumber lying around and you don't want to spend a bunch of money, you can pile up your leaves and grass clippings and tree trimmings and shrub trimmings into black trash bags, poke some holes in the sides and the bottom so they can drain and not hold water. Sit them out in the sun all winter out behind the barn or the storage building. And by spring, a lot of that will be broken down till it's almost composted. It's broken down enough so that you could use it on your beds and things like a mulch, and it will go ahead and just break down. But that's, or you can get even easier and drive around the streets and pick up other people's bags of leaves and take it home and let it make you free compost. Now, these are all still, this is called sheet composting. It's where you just lay all your materials out on top of the ground. And this is also, by the way, a way to make a lasagna garden. You put some thick newspaper right on top of the Bermuda grass and dump your leaves and your vegetable clippings and all your things, whatever you get, right on top of it. And it will eventually make you some good compost. Now, this is even easier if you have some raised beds already and you want to make compost, but you don't want to make a pile of compost. You can just dump it on top of your raised beds and then rake a little bit of that soil or mulch or whatever's over the top of it. And it will look a little bit more attractive, but it will make you some compost right in your raised bed. These are raised beds without sides or anything on them. And they would be perfect, except I'm guessing these people don't live in Oklahoma where they have Bermuda grass, because you know those Bermuda grass runners would love to get in there and come up all in that freshly made compost you're making. So if you live in Vermont, you could do this. This is another good, easy way. They have the raised beds, but they have nice sides on them. And this is my kind of raised bed. You could sit on that side and reach over and pull weeds and tend your vegetables or your ornamental flowers, whatever you have in there, without having to get down on your knees, which gets more important the older you get. And you could still reach over in there and use your fork to stir it up. It's not sitting on grass, it's sitting on a mulched area. So you wouldn't have to worry about the grass runners getting over there. And you could just use these and keep adding to them. And they're going to actually sink, and that's going to settle. So every year you could just add more to it and get better and better raised beds every year. This is called pit composting. And basically, you dig a little hole in your flower bed or in your vegetable garden, and you dump all your vegetable scraps and eggshells and things in there. And then you just rake that soil back over the top of it, and it makes its own compost right there. So it's actually pretty fast and it's really easy. This is another example of pit composting. She actually had raised beds, but she dug a trench all the way between them here and put all the vegetable and organic matter in that trench. Now, if you didn't want to see it like that, which I think you wouldn't, and it also would help it break down better if you could just put some more compost on top of it, or if you just added some mulch on top, or some leaves would probably be the easiest. just dump a bunch of dead leaves in there on top of it, and it's going to make compost for you in probably less than a year. Pit composting made easy. Sometimes late at night, I dig a hole in the backyard to keep the nosy neighbors guessing that she's actually burying her compost, not her husband. So a little bit of a review. A compost pile is not just rotting garbage. Successful compost piles have nitrogenous materials, which is the green stuff, remember, and they have carbonaceous materials, which is the brown stuff. And you add enough water so that they're moist but not soggy. Occasionally mix so all the contents are eventually composted. And you can actually troubleshoot your compost pile. If you have the problem of your compost pile doesn't heat up enough, the solution is to add more green material in the form of grass clippings or manure, or this would be a good time when you could sprinkle some blood meal on the pile, and that makes sure it's gonna make it actually heats up and starts composting again. A problem: if your compost pile smells really bad, and they shouldn't, a good compost pile should actually not smell at all. If it does, it should smell like fresh soil. So if it does, that means the compost is broken down by aerobic bacteria. If it smells like a garbage dump instead of freshly turned soil, that means your pile is going anaerobic. And the decomposition, which actually means anaerobic, means without oxygen. So all you need to do is turn the pile and get more oxygen in there. So you can use your compost in a lot of different ways. It's ready to use when the temperature within the pile begins to cool and remains, and it doesn't heat back up again once you turn it. Redworms. Redworms are really good in that compost pile. So if you're getting your finished compost out and it's full of redworms, do a little happy dance. Don't take them out. Keep them with the compost and add them to your flower beds or wherever you're putting, because they're going to keep working on the organic matter that's present in that soil. They're called nature's rototillers, and that's exactly what they do. They are eating that organic matter. They are taking it down through the deeper soil layers. While they're taking it down, they're making little tunnels, and they're just going to keep eating that organic matter. Meanwhile, they're also getting rid of that organic matter in the form of worm castings, which cost a lot of money if you buy those. If you want to get really fancy and you don't want big particles, which I actually like for most things, you can actually screen to remove particles that are bigger than a 1/2 inch diameter. And the only way I've ever done that is when I use them like in containers, and you want a finer product. You don't want such big stuff. You're still going to want some mulch on the top of your containers though. Now you can get fancy and go on the internet and find these already made, but they're very expensive. Or if you go buy lumber to make them, even the lumber now is expensive. However, Betty Sue's the queen of recycling, so this looks like something she would do. That's one of the flats that you buy that has the little from 2 inch to 4 inch planting containers, or it already has plants in it that you buy at a nursery, and it has the perfect size holes in it. Now it's not going to last probably more than 2 seasons, but they're cheap, and instead of just throwing them away, you can use that to sift your compost through and make finer compost for your containers. You can also get handy and make your own really easy, and you can tell he's just using some old scraps of lumber, and then he's just sandwiched some hardware cloth between it, and that makes a perfect sifter if you want one instead of buying an expensive one. With a little effort, you can make your own compost and have a plentiful supply of the best soil conditioner in the world. The final product will be dark and have a rich, earthy smell, which is a really, really good smell. You can use it in your landscape to create an ideal environment for everything that grows. I would love to have those. This is your whole goal in composting, to have that rich finished product. And see, in their first bin, they've already started adding more material, and they just can keep it coming all the time. And they were smart and used old lumber or looks like old pallets to make their easy compost bins. So this is what you're striving for. If you have really, really good compost that turns into really, really good humus, you can literally grow almost anything, unless it's something for Vermont that won't grow in Oklahoma. This is one of my, all my flower gardens now are butterfly gardens to attract the butterflies. And what you see is actually compost added to this. When we built our house, like I said, 20 years ago, it was heavy, heavy clay soil. So I taught during the teaching season, and I kept my grandkids during the summer. So I had a 12-foot kiddie pool for them to play in. And I decided, after it was sitting there, this was Bermuda grass at first, and this is a driveway and there's a sidewalk on the other side. I thought, well, I'm just going to put the kiddie pool right here by the sidewalk so I can watch the kids playing. And after being there for a whole summer, there wasn't a piece of Bermuda grass left anywhere, which was amazing. And I had a perfectly circular 12-foot flower bed that I used to start. I started adding compost and mulched it. And then the next summer I would move it over. And then I had a 24-foot flower bed, and I just gradually increased it. And then I also add the rocks from Lowe's, which keeps the compost from coming out. And remember, that heavy clay soil, it also breaks down, and I can add more compost to it. And I can actually grow just about anything now, unless it's from Vermont. This is another one in the spring. I mean, heavy. This is one of the beds that I've been to trowel on, trying to dig a hole, literally. So now it's full of larkspur that I got all of them from Betty Sue to start with. And then the yarrow, and they reseed and come back every year. And when I cut them down or pull them up in the spring after they finish blooming down in June, then I just clip them up into smaller pieces and throw them on the ground. And I'm doing sheet composting right there. And then I come in and cover everything with a little bit of mulch on top. And it's just a kind of a cycle that keeps breaking down and getting better every year. Sometimes it gets so good that I had 500 larkspur had to pull up last year, but it was worth it. And this is another area where I use the swimming pool method, and it's just gotten better and better every year. So good that the birds planted asparagus there in the background. This was the first one by the driveway and sidewalk where I kept, it's like 3 swimming pools wide now, so like 36 feet long. And till the kids outgrew the wading pools. This is down at the end of my driveway where I have clay soil, but some of it's worse clay soil than the other clay soil. And this down at the end of the driveway is the worst clay soil. Literally, I couldn't dig a hole with a spade when it was dry. And if it was wet enough to dig, then all the clay stuck to the shovel and my shoes until I couldn't dig a hole or get anything out. You know how that is if you have clay. But right now, all I do is let the leaves from the crepe myrtle fall on the ground in the fall. And notice my crepe myrtles have not been murdered. And then I let them lay there. I put some in the spring when I want it to look a little nicer. I cover it with enough bark mulch, and then I just let those keep breaking down, and those little worms are in there. They even working all winter because our ground in Oklahoma doesn't freeze. This is a different view of it. But I literally couldn't grow anything in there when I first started growing anything in there. You recognize that? Half these plants Betty Sue gave me. I love Maxine. She's saying, of course I have compost, or as some people call it, my refrigerator. Did something just move in there? Do you know what the correct term is for gluten-free, sugarless, vegan brownies? Compost. And my gosh, look at it. They even look like compost. So happy gardening and happy composting. And this is my name and my email. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, I'd be glad to answer your emails. And I do write a Master Gardener column every week for several newspapers and several blogs on the internet. If you would be interested in getting any of my emails, then if you'll just send me one, and I'll be glad to add you to my list. And even if you live in Vermont, the basics of gardening are the same everywhere. The plants are mostly the things that are different. And we have amazing winters if you think about it in Oklahoma. Weird, but I mean, we had ice and snow last week, and it was almost hot today. And we actually are getting rain in southern Oklahoma today, thank goodness. So just send me an email if you want to know anything. If I don't know it, I'll make something up. No, like Taylor says, we know how to do research. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That was very, very good and greatly appreciated for you to share your wisdom.
Are there any questions for Pat before we move on to the next talk? You feel free to put them in the chat box, or if you would like to unmute yourself, you can do that as well. If you have any questions while you're typing that out, I do have one question just for myself. How do you know when to turn your compost?
When you don't see any more steam coming out, and when you think it's just not doing anything else, and if you can, you just kind of get used to watching it, and but you can actually, if you want to, like, turn it every 2 weeks and just kind of put it on a schedule, if that makes it easier than trying to figure out if it's still hot enough. So like every 2 weeks at least.
Okay, that's a good ballpark. I wasn't sure if it was every 2 weeks or every couple months or something like that. So that's definitely good to.
Now we want to have it almost finished in a couple of months.
Gotcha. That's true. Okay, gotcha. I don't see any questions. Yeah, I don't see any additional questions. So if Betty Sue, if you would like to go ahead and start, you can feel free to do so.
Okay, my segment was supposed to be on vegetable gardening, and I don't know how much you need to know or do know, so bear with me. I'll tell you what I think you need to know. Okay. First of all, vegetable gardening is really making a comeback. And why? Well, for one thing, you get fresh produce. It can save money, but the initial expense of probably setting up a garden the first year or so may not seem like you're saving money. You know what chemicals are used on your produce. Although a lot of ours is governed by rules and laws and regulations, how do we really know what's on our produce sometimes? And then you can grow what you want, the varieties you want. Research even shows that gardening is great for you as a gardener, both emotionally and physically, along with the nutrition that you're going to get from your own garden. Whoops, went way far. So what do we need to know about your garden? First of all, you need to know where you're going to put it. You need to know your soil type, which Pat talked about quite a bit, so we won't have to spend as much time on that. You need to know what kind of crops you're going to plant. You need to know what kind of a garden you want, how you're going to lay it out. You need to know how you're going to water it. You need to know about rotation of crops. You need to know some planting methods, weed control, and pest control. We probably will not get to all of that, but we'll get to a lot of it before the presentation is over. First of all is finding that site. You need a well-drained soil. You need a level site. You can have as much as a 1 to 2% slope, but you don't want too much of it, because when you water, the water is going to go down the hill. If it rains, it may wash out your garden if it's has too much of a slope. You need the garden to be convenient to you from the house, and you need to be convenient for water. You don't want to have to drag hoses and all a long ways. You also need some, according to where you live, you'll need some protection from animals. The worst animals for your garden are deer, rodents, and armadillos. They do say that if you put a fence around your garden about 2 feet high, it'll keep out the armadillos. Deer, you'd have to have a fence a lot higher than that. So you'll have to have other ways to protect against deer and rodents. You need at least 6 hours of sunlight. More is better. There are some vegetables that can take a light shade, lettuce and radishes and some of your greens, but most of them require 6+ hours of daylight, of sunlight. It needs to be protected from heavy winds or winds, but it also needs to be where it can get air movement. So you have to watch that. You don't want it close to trees or shrubs, not just because of the shade, but the roots on trees and shrubs will rob your garden of the water a lot of times. So you'll have to use too much water. The site, you'd have to prepare it. If you're live where it's never been a garden before, and you're going to have to remove the grasses and the weeds. If you have Bermuda, all I can say is good luck. You can consider raised beds if you're Bermuda. You can go through a process called solarization, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it's detailed what all you have to do. And in desperation, you can use good old Roundup or its kin to kill it. It's more than one application. Bermuda is really, really hard to get rid of. They should have kept it in Africa, but anyway, we have it. You'll need to remove rocks and other debris so that you'll have out of the garden space. And you need to orient the garden. Most of the time they say it's best to orient it north and south, but east and west will work if you put the tall plants on the north side. So you don't have to have it the other direction. Here's a method of solarization. You use a clear plastic that's less than 6 mil. If it's greater than that, the sunlight doesn't get through it too well, even if it's clear. You water the area real good, then you'll seal the edges around that. And I mean, seal it good to where when you look at it, you can see condensation on the underneath side. You'll need to leave it for at least 4 weeks in full sunlight. July and August are the best months to do that. Of course, that's too late for starting a garden this year. And unfortunately, you'll probably have to repeat it because those Bermuda rhizomes go deep. Not only, they just seem to show up everywhere. But after you get through with the solarization, you've not only killed the Bermuda, hopefully, and the weeds, hopefully, but you've also killed all the good guys that are in the soil, the bacteria and all the little animals and fungi and mycorrhizae, all those things that help you with the gardening. So you need to add compost, which Pat just talked about, and that'll replace some of the good guys. The second step is to know your soil. Healthy soil, as Pat mentioned, is the key to healthy plants. If you have loamy soil, consider yourself very lucky. If you have sandy or clay soil, you'll need to amend with compost or organic matter, which is organic matter. Pat again mentioned this with sandy soil, you have good drainage. If I have really sandy soil, and I have no problem with drainage. It can rain and you can go out there and walk on it and not get your feet muddy. It's great for root crops, radishes, turnips, carrots, and those kinds of things. But it is an advantageous because it freezes later in winter and it warms faster in the spring. So you do have a longer growing season, but it erodes easily and it does not retain moisture, and it does not retain a lot of the needed plant nutrients. Whereas clay soil will drown the roots, and the heavy weight makes it difficult to work. If you've ever worked yourself and had boots on or whatever, you have to carry it in the clay back. It just sticks to you, everything. It's impermeable. It is erosion resistant. The fortunate thing about it, it usually is fairly fertile, and it does hold the water and the nutrients. Both, though, will benefit greatly by adding a lot of organic matter. The soil test is always the first beginning. You need to know what you have. There's no need to add fertilizer if you don't need it. And if you do need it, you need to know how much to add. The three main chemicals that you're going to be adding will be nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are a lot of trace elements, but normally those are not too likely to be missing. The other thing you'll need to do is have it'll test for pH. So if you need a soil test, oh, well, wait a minute, most require pH of 6 to 7.5, which is in the kind of a neutral range. 7 is neutral, but if you can, $10 is the best money you'll spend in your gardening. OSU will test your soil for that, and I'll show you how to take the sample in just a minute. If you do have pH that's high, above 7, you can add sulfur. Excuse me, I got that wrong. It's backwards. I'm sorry. If your pH is high, you will add lime. I've got it backward. No, that's right. You add sulfur. Excuse me, to get it back down to acidic, because sulfur turns into an acid. If the pH is low, you'll add lime, and it takes a while to get that changed, but you can do that. To take a soil sample, you need to take it from a minimum of 10, probably 20 different areas, because you'd be amazed at how different your soil is in different places. So you'll insert a spade to about 12 inches, if you can, 10 to 12 inches. Bring your soil up, take the center of your soil sample, dump it into a bucket, and go around and collect from at least 10, but 20 or better. Mix all that soil together. Make sure it's very, very dry. Then you can either put it in a bag that you can get from the OSU Extension office, or take it in a pint jar to the Extension office. They will send it off for you, and for $10, they will evaluate your soil. It is got to be the best thing you can do for any kind of thing you're going to raise on your property. The third step is after the soil test, you're going to amend your soil before or when planting. You'll apply 1/2 of the recommended amount of nitrogen and the recommended amount of phosphorus and potassium by either broadcasting or use a spreader going north and south and then east and west, and then till it in. Later, after your garden starts growing, you will side dress with the remaining nitrogen. You dig a trench made with a hole about 4 to 6 inches from your plants on both sides of the row, and put it in that trench, being very, very careful not to get the fertilizer on your plants. Cover with soil and then water. Now, we're going to have to find out what style of gardening you're going to want. Are you going to do the traditional gardening? Are you going to use containers? Or are you going to use a raised bed? The traditional method, of course, are those long, orderly rows. I remember as a child, my parents and they'd all talk about so-and-so's garden, and they'd talk about how straight his rows were. That was an important thing. Straight rows don't make the vegetables taste one bit better, believe me. But on a traditional garden with those rows, if you walk between the rows, that kind of ruins the soil structure. You do require tillers, wheelbarrows, or something. It requires bigger equipment, but it is still the best method for growing crops like corn, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. And it requires more water because you have to water a larger area. Whereas raised beds, you can concentrate your compost. It has improved drainage. The soil gets warmer in the cold weather, and so you can plant earlier in a raised bed. They're much easier to weed. It's easier to gather the produce. And you can modify your soil structure for specific crops like blueberries, but the initial expense is more. Now, let me go back over here a minute. If you see the bed in the lower right, that one is mine. The other two are not. The one in the lower right is mine, and that's where I grow blueberries. My soil is not acid at all, but we modified that container, a raised bed, to make it acidic enough that it grew blueberries, and I have a freezer full of them now because it's produced like crazy. So if you want to modify it for a specific crop, a raised bed is the way to go. So maybe the best idea would be to try a little bit of both or all three of the methods. You can grow a lot of things in containers now. They're even specially breeding seeds or plants that'll grow smaller so that you can grow them in containers. I love this one. This is a method I have similar beds, but I don't have the cover yet for them. But see how they put the PVC pipe in, and on the backside you can see their cloth. If they can plant early, and if the frost or bad weather, they can pull that cloth up over that and cover it, and they can produce a lot earlier and actually go into the fall later too, because they can cover it in the wintertime also for a while. There's your traditional garden, and there's those rows that they used to have laid out. Because of my age, I don't do that method anymore. But a lot of people, if you want a large garden, or what they call it, I know when they used to call them truck gardens, when you had a large amount of garden space and raised a lot of several, crops. Now, when you're ready to plant, think about some things. What are you going to your family like, or are you going to grow it to sell? I don't know. But whatever you need to plant, only what you like or what you can sell. And then when you want to harvest, if you look over to the right, and this one just came in today, I stole it off of the internet. Summer vacation, I can't because my plants need me. So you need to plan when things are going to come on if you have other things you need to do. How much do you really need? Remember, you're going to have to water, you're going to have to weed, and you'll need to harvest and maybe preserve whatever you produce later. So, unless you have a lot of neighbors or a lot of people you want to share with.
Or make compost.
Or make compost, right? You can make compost with it. You can pour it into there, but still, you need to be very careful and not overdo like a lot of us do. So let's talk about some of the vegetables you could plant. There are some vegetables that are called perennial, which means they come back and they come back and they come back. Asparagus, horseradish, Jerusalem artichokes, and winter onions. I've only had good luck. Well, I've had good luck with the Jerusalem artichokes, but they like to take over because they grow so big. But the asparagus is a good vegetable for you to try. You'll have to allow a space at the edge of the garden where they will not be disturbed, or put them in a special raised bed someplace, because you're going to have those for 10 years or more. Hopefully. Let's talk about asparagus. That is one of the most popular. It's easy to grow. And once you plant it, I said you'll have it for years. You can even plant it in your flower beds because it's a pretty graceful plant that'll look pretty with the leather flowers if you want to. You plant the crowns in either the spring or fall of the year. And the ones you need to buy, if you really want production, is the male plants, because they give you the highest production. And those are the ones that have Jersey in their name. There may be more, but I know the ones that have Jersey in their name are male. And the reason for that, of course, is that they will spend their time making the stem and not any time making a flower or seed if they're the male plant. They tell you to delay the harvest that first year, and this is really hard to do because the first year the plants will be very spindly and, you know, wouldn't be much to eat anyway, but it's sure hard to leave them there. Then in the second, you can, at the second year, you can harvest a couple of weeks to 3 weeks. And then the third year, you can do it for a month. And the fourth year, you'll have full production. You can buy, though, roots or crowns that are already 1 or 2 years old. So that would give you a faster production. Stop harvest when the spear diameter gets pencil size. They're just a pretty plant, and like I said, they're very nutritious, easy to cook, and easy to freeze even. There's an asparagus on the right hand side. It's a real lacy foliage. Now this is past picking time right now because it's already covered up the stems, but it's at least on the other side of the garden to where it doesn't interfere with the other plants. For spring, summer gardening, you will plant usually what we call cool season crops. These develop best if before the temperature gets 50 degrees. It doesn't mean freezing, but just just barely below 50. However, some of them will tolerate a light frost. The quality, though, deteriorates under warm conditions. These are the cool season crops. That includes beets, spinach, cole, all those crops like that. And I'll show you another list on the next slide in a minute. Then you have the warm season crops. These all develop best after the temperature is 50 degrees. And I'm talking this time not soil temperature, but I'm talking the air temperature, but we'll talk about the soil temperature too later. These are killed by frost. That's like beans, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, corn, cucurbits. Here they are. On the left-hand sade, you have your beets, cabbage, carrots, kohlrabi, and all those that are early season crops. I made those in orange because if you look over there, they're also over here on what you call the late season crops, which means you can plant those in your fall garden also. Some of the very same things you planted in the early garden. Your warm season are beans, lima beans, green beans, sweet corn, cucumbers, eggplant, muskmelons, peppers, potatoes, pumpkin squash, tomatoes, and watermelon. So you can plant the ones on the left side early, the ones in the middle late, and the ones on the right you can plant again in the fall of the garden, fall. But let's talk about some of the spring gardening tips. You say use recommended varieties. There is a fact sheet OSU puts out on vegetable varieties for the home garden in Oklahoma. However, that fact sheet's a little bit old and there are a lot of new varieties out there. So don't be afraid to try some new ones, but you're always better, know you're doing the right thing if you plant the recommended ones. The hardest thing for me to ever do is to thin the plants if you plant them too thick, okay? But you need to thin them because they need to have room to grow. Use mulch to conserve the moisture, control the weeds, and to reduce fruit rots. Avoid excessive walking and working in the garden when the foliage and soil are wet. Examine the garden often to keep ahead of potential problems. They say that the best tool in your garden is your shadow, which means you're there a lot. Keep garden free of weeds, insects, and diseases. And when possible, harvest the vegetables during the cool hours of the day. It's better for you and the plants and the fruit and vegetables. Spring gardening also includes planting onions and potatoes, which is about that time right now. And there's another fact sheet called Oklahoma Garden Planting Guide. Gives you all kinds of information on planting dates for most vegetables. In Oklahoma, though, generally the cool season vegetables can be planted between March the 15th and February the 15th and March the 10th. So that's soon. The warm season vegetables can be planted between April the 10th and May the 20th, generally. There's I found this out the hard way because I used to try to start plants early. There is a temperature at which the seeds germinate. That means sprout. And it's at different temperatures for different plants. For example, if you look, I put the cool season in blue, the lettuce and the onion. Their minimum temperature they'll germinate, or both of those, is 35. They've got an optimum, which means they'll germinate the best between 40 and 80 on lettuce, and the maximum is 85. All of this you can find in the fact sheets from OSU. Snap beans, I always want to plant them early because I want to try to get them picked before it gets too hot, get them to read and pick them before the weather gets too hot. But they don't want to germinate until 60 to 85. Now, germinate means this is the soil temperature because they're going to germinate there in the soil. Corn, look at that, 60 to 95. Okra, 70 to 95 is its optimum. So keep in mind that they need certain temperatures to germinate. Then there's a soil temperature that's the best for even that for them to germinate. For example, snap beans, if you look at here, look at this, the soil temperature at which they will germinate the best is going to be at 59 degrees. Oat corn will germinate the best at 68 degrees. Whoops, wait a minute. Yeah, 68. No, at 50 degrees, excuse me. I'm getting it all confused here. But the thing you need to remember, and I hope all of you are familiar with the fact that you can go on the Mesonet website. Mesonet's a weather channel, a weather program that is the only thing I know that OU and OSU does together. And they will let you give you the soil temperature for every county in the state. And so you'll know what the soil temperature is and know what the best temperature is for you to start planting your gardens. Here's one that I stole off of the internet. It's from www.gardeners.com, but is one little chart that you could probably run off and print and keep in your garden journal so that you know exactly what the best temperatures are for planting, soil temperatures are for planting all these crops. So I recommend you go on that website and lift it just like I did, okay? All right, planting times, you got times. Follow the directions for spacing, depth, and time on the back of your seed packages if possible. They tell you on the back exactly how deep to plant them, how far apart to plant them, and the whole bit. But if you happen to buy a seed at something like a feed store, sometimes where they just shovel it, put that little shovel thing full into your bag, they don't tell all of that. So a rule of thumb for seeds is to plant them 2 to 2.5 times the size of the seed deep. Make sure you keep the seeds moist, not soppy wet, because they'll spoil, but keep them moist until the plants germinate. And a little sidelight, lettuce is one of the few seeds, vegetable seeds, that require light to germinate. So if you cover that seed, you cover it very, very lightly because it has to have light before the seed will germinate. All the others required are neutral. One of the ways to make your garden really work for you is to do what we call succession planting. Succession planting, I'm going to talk about 2 types. There are more than these, but these are the 2 types we'll talk about. One of them is planting late season crops after your early season ones have been harvested. For example, peas followed by beans. I mean, these are like English peas. And our 2 multiple plantings of a single crop. For example, you plant crops 1 to 3 weeks apart. Know the dates to maturity of the vegetables to determine when your first and last succession should be. And some of these on the right will show you some veggies for succession. You can plant radishes, spinach, and baby greens once every 1 week intervals until the time that you're not supposed to be planting them when they get into warm season. Beans and beets, you plant at 2 weeks intervals. 3-week intervals are your cucumbers and your summer squash. There are other examples, but those are some that you can continue to plant the same crop, but plant them in intervals so that you'll have a continuous supply of them. Succession planting using different plants means you use the same garden space to grow more than one crop. You replace an early crop with a late crop, which means a cool season with a warm season. For example, plant early spring greens, replace with beans, which are nice because the beans will help fix nitrogen, and then replace with fall kale. So you can actually plant 3 different things. So you just plant, grow, harvest, and repeat. Plant, grow, harvest, and repeat. Make the best use of your garden space. But throughout the season, regardless of cool season or warm season, remember to mulch, mulch, and mulch. It retains the moisture. It moderates the soil temperature. It reduces the weed competition. It reduces erosion. It helps keep disease down. It improves your soil till. You can till it in after the season and add to your soil. It adds nutrients. It makes the garden more sanitary. It keeps your soil from getting on plants during rains, which can cause diseases. You can use wood chips, shredded straw, shredded leaves, bark, dry grass clippings, cardboard. My favorite are newspapers, but you have to keep them wet and keep something on top of them, or bagged mulch. What would be perfect would be to lay the newspapers down and then cover that with bagged mulch. So you wouldn't have to buy too much of the bagged mulch, because newspapers would keep the weeds out better than practically any of those. And we got those lovely weeds. The weeds, you'd like to go like a no-till garden. We can just let it go, but you can't do that because the weeds compete for sunlight, water, nutrients, and space. Crabgrass, the lower left, is a pain. I mean, I don't know, it must produce seed it does produce seed by the millions. Dandelions and the chickweed, there's henbit, there's several others that are very common, but the only thing you need to do is just keep on top of it if you can. The best way, of course, is a sharp hole, and again, mulch. Hand pulling, if you pull it by hand, you better pull it up root or it will come back up again. And again, you see the example of the newspapers covering around the plant. The only thing is you have to keep them wet, or you have to cover them, or they'll dry out and blow away. See, but I do use a lot of newspapers. And then there's water. You have to have irrigation of some sort. Many methods are available, but the drip irrigation is absolutely the best, and it's even better if you can put a timer on it. It allows for a steady dripping and allows the water to get directly to the plant's roots where it is needed, not all over the place, in between and everywhere else, because those little emitters can be right up next to the roots. There's no water wasted or lost to areas not needing water or to evaporation when you use the drip method. And it doesn't splash on the plants to cause the spread of disease. So it's really the best way to go. It is an initial expense, but it's not like a soaker hose, because the soaker hoses, if they last a season, that's pretty good. They usually don't. And they don't emit the water evenly all along. Whereas these drip irrigation things with the emitters, it keeps the amount of water the same everywhere. And you can just pull it back up at the end of the year and store it and use it again the next year if you have a traditional garden. During the dry periods, you need to provide water deeply and frequently. Most plants need about 1 inch of water per week, so generally you will water 2 to 3 times per week in the morning. With my sandy soil, I have to water more often than that. Here's the drip irrigation set out with a traditional garden in all cases. So it's just really the best way to go. Like I said, it's got an initial expense, but you can reuse that hose from year to year. Mine has lasted 3 or 4 years. I don't know how long it will last. All right, let's talk about some other vegetables you can plant. The most common vegetable crops, other than the succulents, are tomatoes, 77%, peppers, 72%, beans, 58%, So those, we will cover those top three because it's about all the time we'll have to cover. So we'll cover those tonight, plus the cucumbers. The favorite crop in the United States are tomatoes. It's interesting because only a couple hundred years ago, they were thought to be poisonous. Now we have to have tomatoes for everything. And the varieties of tomatoes are going out of this. They're coming up with all kinds of varieties all of the time. Used to, there was about 10 varieties when I was growing up, and that was it. But now you can get them in teeny tiny ones. You can get them all colors. You can get them yellows and oranges and reds, purples, blacks, you name it. You can get all colors now. Tomatoes seem to be the most popular home garden crop grown by home gardeners. They are usually grown with along with eggplant and cold crops can be started earlier in the garden when conditions are favorable. You can start these in the house, in your house or in a greenhouse or earlier to set out later. A lot of people buy the transplants. Seeds are getting expensive. Transplants are even more expensive. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do and kind of up to what your arrangements are. If you'll notice, these are definitely started at home because they're in milk cartons and styrofoam cups. So you can see that they are. I've been starting mine now for about 10 years, I guess, in the greenhouse. But I do have a greenhouse. And that way you can start as many of whatever you want or the kind you want. And well, I don't know. I just like doing it. But if you purchase them, make sure you purchase plants that are stocky and healthy and are a suitable variety for where you are. And if you can, get some that are disease resistant. And those are the initials. Sometimes you'll see on those, but I haven't seen those initials on them lately. But the VFNT, V is a verticillium, F is a fusarium, and the root knot nematode is the N, and tobacco mosaic virus resistant. And keep in mind that resistant does not mean they won't get it. It means they're not as likely to get it. And then you need to talk about whether the tomato is a determinate or an indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes will grow to a certain height and then they stop. They'll yield tomato, but only over a 4 to 6 week period. And they may need to be staked. They don't have to be as much as the other. Indeterminate grow and flower throughout the growing season, but they'll produce smaller harvest at a time, but they bear over a longer season, and they do need to be staked because they grow so high. The only problem with this determinate and indeterminate bit is that they've been breeding these tomatoes for different characteristics. And now all of a sudden you can't tell whether they are determinate or indeterminate. Some of them are actually a combination of the two. So you'll have to watch that. Here are some of them that used to be called determinate: Early Girl, Celebrity, Sue, and the Bradley. But if you'll notice, these are semi-determinate, which means they don't completely fit the characteristics of a determinate. The indeterminate are the Better Boy, Big Beef, Jet Setter, Lemon Boy, Cherokee Purple. Just make sure I'd probably be a good idea just to stake them to begin with. When you plant tomatoes, tomatoes are a little bit different than any other transplant. Wherever their stem touches the soil, it'll grow roots. So if you have a long, lanky tomato plant, take off the leaves. It doesn't show the leaves coming off over here, but if you take off the leaves and lay it down and then just pull up, you can see on the right, pull it up and to the leaf just a little bit above ground and cover that horizontal part. All of that will grow roots along the stem, making it a whole lot sturdier for Oklahoma winds. The other method you can do if you wanted to is dig them a big deep hole and put them all the way down in the hole. Just make sure you leave the growing tip exposed, and make sure you remove all the other leaves going up and down, because that's where those roots will come out, is where those nodes were, where the leaves were. When you do plant them 3 to 4 feet apart and in rows 3 to 5 feet apart, if you're planting them in a traditional garden, you can plant them in a container, but it has to be a large container Or you can buy the little patio tomato transplants and plant them in smaller containers. Plant in full sun when the soil temperature, not the air temperature, but the soil temperature is 65 degrees. Again, I have an advantage in that, and my sandy soil gets warm pretty fast. You might want to use a starter fertilizer. In my soil, I have to because of the sand again. You can do it more than one way. You can put 1 pint of a liquid fertilizer starter around each plant, or a good shaking of a slow release fertilizer. Those pelleted ones, kind of like Osmocote, works well. You may need to protect from the sun and you probably will in Oklahoma, protect from the sun until it's hardened. You can put something like a shade thing on top of it, or something next to it to shade the sun off of it for a while. If you have too much nitrogen and or water, it can cause the plant to stay in the vegetative stage, which means you don't get tomatoes. You may have beautiful green plants because that's what the nitrogen works on, is the stem and the leaves, but you won't get any tomatoes. So don't put too much nitrogen on your tomatoes. This is the method we used one year where we put the tomatoes, we staked them, we laid newspaper down, and then we covered the newspaper with mulch. And then we had the drip irrigation. You can't see it, but the drip irrigation is lying underneath it. And yes, that garden has too much of a slope, but that's the only place I had sun that I could plant. You really need to add a cage or a trellis to help get the highest yields. Now, highest yields means that's how many you pick. It'll have the same number of tomatoes, but they'll be rotten or whatever if they're next to the soil. You can make a cage real easily with reinforcing wire, the one like they use, when they pour concrete. That's the cheapest way to go. And you can cut it to make a 15-inch cage. Or you can buy cages, but you have to be careful because a lot of those cages they sell are just too small for a regular tomato plant. If you want to, you could stake it and weave it like in a trellis, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. If you leave the plant on the ground, it has a high amount of fruit rot and a high incidence of leaf diseases. Here's one method where you can do the trellis. You just lay a piece of cattle fencing up against some metal post, plant them up next to it, and then you can tie them to it or weave them in and out of that, and it'll support the tomato plants. The one on the left is trellis. The one on the right is cage. You can barely see the cage, but it is in there. The trellis really allows it to have a little bit more air movement than the cage does. Here are some cages. The one in the upper right is the one made out of that reinforcement panel I told you about. The one on the left, we have some of those, but they were gifted to me because mine are about to wear out. And I looked up the price and I know I will not get any more of them. They're expensive, but they're really neat because you put the first panel down. And if you look at the top of it, it's got little holes. So when it gets really tall, you can put the second panel on top of that, or the second section on top. And it really supports your tomatoes really, really well, but they are pretty expensive. Okay, now what do you need to do about watering your tomatoes? Maintain good soil moisture without waterlogging the soil. Of course, organic matter will help hold it. Remember, while allowing good aeration, water every 3 to 4 days. Use a drip irrigation and keep the foliage dry. Again, mulch the soil. And if you have even watering, that means you don't let it get real dry before you water it, or like yo-yo with the watering. You won't have as much blossom. You won't have blossom end rot, and you won't have that shoulder splitting that a lot of tomatoes get. The interesting thing about tomatoes too is that their flowers will not set when nighttime temperatures are above 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, I'm going to put in a little thing here. That is true of most tomato plants. species or varieties, I guess. But they are working on tomatoes to make them go into different types of growing seasons. So you need to be careful about that. Some of them may do better than what I'm saying because they're previously they would not. When daytime temperatures go above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you need to go ahead and harvest your fruit. It will ripen, and there's nothing, they keep talking about vine ripened fruit. Tomatoes will ripen really good. If you just pick them, take them in the house, do not refrigerate them. Or put them where they'll, can be aired in an airy spot, and they will ripen just fine. I've already said, don't refrigerate the tomatoes if you can help it. The flavor is lessened. And of course, when you buy tomatoes at the grocery store, where are they? They're in the cold food section. So I don't know if they've gone down to 55 degrees or not. I haven't taken my thermometer to the grocery store to find out, but I may do that. Because when they get down to that temperature, the flavor is lessened. Second most popular vegetable are peppers. And there are all kinds of peppers. I had no idea there was as many kinds as there were until I started following a guy that raises them in Oklahoma City. The sweet ones are known as bell, pimento, and sweet banana. Hot, man, there are thousands of different kinds of hot ones. The jalapeno, serrano, habanero, you name it. They go on and on. The heat is from a chemical called capsaicin, which is interesting because bell peppers don't have any in it, and all the other peppers do, but they're still all in the same family. It's a fat soluble compound. It will not come off of your hands or whatever if you get it on. So if you're handling hot peppers, do it with gloves. I learned the hard way. You can't take a contact out of your eye after dealing with hot peppers. So watch out for that. They grow best in a soil of pH 5.5 to 7, which is a little bit acidic to neutral. They're usually established as transplants, and you set them out at least 2 weeks after the air temperature can be relied on to stay above 60 degrees. Plant 18 to 24 inches apart and rows 2 to 3 feet apart. Now, I start all my tomato plants and my pepper plants. I start peppers earlier because it takes them longer to produce. So, and if you're trying to start your plants, you may want to start the peppers earlier. And cutworms like to get these, as do they with tomato plants. So you can wrap the stem or with paper cups that have bottoms removed or cardboard tubes to put around the stem to keep them from cutworms from getting them. Because there's nothing like last year we went out day after I planted them and I didn't do that. I had 3 plants laying on the ground. The third most popular vegetable are the bush or green beans that are fairly easy to grow. You can get the string or stringless, but why would anyone buy the string when you'd have to string them? Pole beans, bush beans, wax beans, snap beans, French velour, which have become my favorite. I don't know whether I'll get them or not again, but they're purple when they're on the vine. But when you cook them, they're green, but they are so much easier to find when you're picking them because of that purple. That's kind of the reason I like them. Here's what they look like in the plant. And you can see the stems are kind of purple also. I don't have the beans on them yet. This is before they started producing, but they are heavy producers. I can find purple varieties, but the French velours, I've only been able to find them in one place. If you want to, you could soak the seeds for an hour before planting. That'll enhance the germination, which might make it happen half a day sooner. If you have low humidity and high temperatures, it can cause the blossoms to drop. Whole beans will shade other vegetables, so you want to plant them on the north side of the garden. Beans do have sort of a short growing season in Oklahoma sometimes because they like part of it to be cool, and they don't like to get too hot either. So you have to be careful about planting them. Plant them when the ground is warm. The best would be when the soil temperature is 80 degrees. use the watering trench along the side of a row until the seeds germinate. In other words, dig that trench kind of like you did with the fertilizer for the other crops, and water along that trench, but don't saturate the ground. If you want to, you can apply an all-purpose fertilizer when flowering. Pick the beans carefully and regularly because they will grow more. Select the bean varieties that produce continuously through the growing season. Select stringless varieties, especially if you got pole beans. Pole beans would make so much more sense if you have a place to grow them because you can stand up and pick some of them. You don't have to bend over. Or I raise mine in a raised bed so I can sit on the edge of it and pick the beans. But pole beans would be perfect for doing that. And then there are the succulents, okay? This is your squash, your cucumbers, your watermelon, pumpkins. It's most popular in home gardens are cucumbers and squash out of all those. The others are popular to eat, but not so much in gardens because they take up so much space, your watermelon and your pumpkins especially. They're warm season crops and they need heat to thrive. They need heat to thrive. So plant early to beat the pest. Can cover with a thin cloth. I don't know how someone has the answer to the squash bugs. I want someone to let me know. I've read everything that they've said to do and I've done it all. But one of the things that I did do one year was to cover it. I had a cold frame and it was a deep one. And I planted the squash in there until it started blooming. And I succeeded a little bit with that. Another way to do it is to cover it with a thin cloth, like real lightweight frost cloth or something like that. And if you can keep it covered for a while, you can keep the bugs off of it. But the trouble is you have to have that cloth off or the cold frame cover off when they start flowering because they have to be pollinated and you have to have the honeybees and other pollinating insects to do it. So I don't know. They say to plant real early to beat the pest, but then you have to have the soil temperature that's warm. So a lot of people start their plants and then they do them, transplant them later to say, to try to beat the squash bug. But those squash bugs they are hard to whatever. I think if you go to the moon, you'll find them there. There are many more things that can be planted in the garden. Internet is extremely helpful, but make sure you're looking at literature written for your gardening zone and reliable sources. I rely a lot on the OSU extension, but there are some other states that have similar gardening areas like we do, South Carolina and sometimes Texas. Some of their literature is good too, but make sure you have reliable sources. All right, what if you have late cold weather is predicted? This row cover is wonderful. You can get it. It comes at different weights, but you can put it directly over your plants. You plant your crops, you think you're safe, and all of a sudden you get weather predicted to be below freezing. This will actually protect many of your vegetables for a while. And again, the fact that you can just lay it on top of it. Don't ever use plastic because plastic will ruin everything under it. You can put plastic on top of this, but not under it if you want to really protect it. But a lot of people, Neil Sperry, for example, he has a lot of gardening things, not vegetable gardens, but plants that he has now fixed his row covers and he labels them for wherever he puts them and he just wraps them back up and gets them back out for the next year. So it will last if you don't have an animal to tear it up or whatever. They'll last over and over again. So they really do save the crop down below. They add, it's according to which weight you get, but they can add from 10 to 15 degrees or, well, somewhere in that vicinity. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is crop rotation. It's someone was asking me something about a gardening the other day, and she said, my husband wants to plant beans in the same area you planted them in last year and the year before and the year before. And she said, don't do that. And he said, why? I've always planted them there. Well, because if you plant the same thing over and over again in the same area, it takes out the same nutrients over and over again, and if there are any diseases that were on those plants at all, they're there too. So crop rotation is it's just something you ought to follow. And all it means is don't plant the same thing in the same area every year. Now you can do it more than 1 year, but not every year. It helps maintain the soil fertility. It helps avoid or reduce problems with soil-borne diseases and some soil-dwelling insects even. It can be applied on a small scale as well as a large, from a square foot garden to acres of farmland. And here's one example. You can plant legumes, your peas, your lima beans, your beans, and plant them in one area. The next year or whatever, plant the lettuce, plant that where you had your lettuce and greens and herbs and cabbage and spinach. Plant those things where you had your fruit crops, which are cucumbers, tomatoes, squash, eggplant, peppers, and melons. And then plant those where you had your root crops the year before. So you go legumes, leaf, fruit, and root crops. By the way, is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? Interesting, you know what Arkansas did? Tomato is Arkansas's fruit, state fruit. Tomato is Arkansas's state vegetable. They solved it by doing it both ways. Okay. It'll help reduce the hazards of plant disease and remove the plant. These are garden tips that you need to remember. Removes hazards of plant diseases. It removes the plant material known to be diseased. It avoids excess soil moisture. Irrigate with drip irrigation. If watering overhead, do it in the morning or it will dry on the leaves. Space your plants to allow air circulation, and stake to allow air movement and keep leaves off of the ground. Weekly scout for a pest or daily would be even better. Fertilize, this is kind of a general rule, fertilize with nitrogen for greens, phosphorus for your fruiting vegetables. Set garden goals that work best for your conditions. Don't try to compete with your neighbors. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Do what's best for you. When possible, harvest produce during the cooler time of the day. Make friends with other gardeners. Share information, tools, and more. Because believe me, you'll learn more from other gardeners than you will probably from me or anybody else. Keep learning, and remember, mistakes are sometimes the best teachers. Topics not covered tonight, and there's not enough time to cover all of it. Plant diseases and their control. There are two kinds of plant diseases. One is called biotic, one's abiotic. Biotic is caused by organisms. Abiotic is caused by conditions that the plants were grown in. Plant pests and their control. Good insects, we didn't even talk about that. Raised bed gardening, which is great. Hoop houses or low tunnels, which are really good for starting early and ending late on your gardens. Cold frames, hot frames. Organic gardening, but I do know that in the October session, you're going to hear about fall vegetable gardens. So you'll get that one then. And we didn't talk about how to start your transplants. There's much to learn about gardening, people, much more than you can ever learn in an hour. But I thank you for your time. Hope you've learned something. There are reference sheets galore that are fact sheets. A lot of them have information, frankly, that you don't need, but they'll have a little bit that you do need. So if you want to run them off, you can print them, highlight the part that you need to know, forget about the rest of it, and just enjoy gardening, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Betty Sue, for that information. Are there any questions for either Pat or Betty Sue? There was one comment I saw. Someone said that they used petunias to help with squash bugs, but they're in Colorado. Have you ever heard of that either?
I've never heard of petunias. I've heard of nasturtiums and something else, but it did not work for us. But it may work there, and I wouldn't mind trying petunias. We'll see. Okay.
That'd be interesting for sure. Okay. We have one question. Do you add mulch throughout the growing season or just at the beginning?
Do I add what?
Mulch.
Mulch. Normally just in the beginning, but if it, we have a heavy rain or something that washes it away, I have to amend it.
Okay. Do you have any tips to deter squirrels?
I really don't. I have a lot of squirrels, but I don't have them in my garden. It's interesting. I don't know why.
They don't bother my garden
I
either.
don't know. They have not bothered. Now, I have trouble with raccoons and armadillos. Those are my enemies. So a good trap for an armadillo works. Sometimes for the coon too, if you can keep the cats out of it.
I do know you mentioned something earlier about deer being an issue for gardens. A lot of times, you can either have a really, really high fence for deer, or
Right.
if you do dual fences can actually deter deer as well. So shorter fences and then
Double fence.
Oh, yeah. Interestingly, I have a lot of deer. I live out in the country. They never bothered my gardens. And I think part of the reason is I use a lot of bottles as my edging. And I think they see the reflection in those bottles. I don't know, but they come up next to, I can watch them out of my front window come up all the way to that garden, but they never come in it.
that's interesting.
They just they'll come right up to my back door.
Are there any other questions? Someone made a comment. They said the deer were eating their fruit trees, and hanging up Irish Spring soap on the trees helped with that.
I've heard of that.
I've heard that too, yeah. I've not tried it, but I've heard it.
I've not heard that one. I
Yeah.
mean, probably, yeah, that could definitely see how that would work.
I was supposed to get rid of something else too.
Okay, if there are no other questions, just a reminder, let me look at the date real quick. March 7th, I believe,
So it's
is the next Zoom series at 6 p.m. And we will have a couple people talking about chicken production, so just general chicken production, and then also looking into the laws and that kind of stuff for selling eggs and for selling broilers as well. So with that, if there is nothing else, we will be that concludes our second Zoom series. So thank you again, ladies, for taking the time out of your day to give us the pointers on some compost and some gardening. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.